Okay, so let's unpack this. Our ability to think, to learn, remember, our cognition, it's fundamental.
Absolutely. And it turns out it's deeply connected to systems we might not immediately think of as being related to the brain.
We're doing a deep dive today into some fascinating research looking at these, well, seemingly separate systems.
Exactly. We're focusing on two big players. First, the HPA axis.
Right, the hypothalamic-pituitary-adrenal axis. That's basically the body's central stress response system, isn't it?
That's the one. Starts in the brain, signals down to the adrenal glands, manages stress hormones like cortisol.
In the second player.
That's your gut microbiota, or GM. Trillions of microbes living in your gut. More than just digestion aids, we now see them as a huge internal environmental
That's
factor.
influencing all sorts of things.
Immunity, development, behavior. It's a long list.
So the goal here is to explore what the science says about the links between these gut microbes, the HPA stress axis, and ultimately cognition.
And it's definitely not simple. It's a complex back and forth relationship. Researchers are still mapping out. This whole network is often called the microbiota-gut-brain, or MGB axis.
A bidirectional pathway.
Precisely. And the HPA axis is right in the middle, mediating how stress impacts this whole gut-brain conversation.
And this connection gets established really early on, doesn't it?
It does. We mostly get our microbes around birth. Things like delivery mode, vaginal versus C-section matter.
And then diet, breastfeeding, any infections, stress, even genetics shape it.
Yeah, that first year or so is seen as this critical window. The gut microbes are developing right alongside the immune system, the HPA axis itself, and key parts of the brain.
Animal studies have really highlighted this, especially the germ-free animal models.
Oh, absolutely. They show significant differences in brain development and function when there's no microbiota present early on. It underlines how crucial that early microbial colonization is.
So how does this communication actually happen? How does the gut talk to the brain and vice versa? This is the really intriguing part.
There are multiple pathways working together. The HPA axis itself is a big one.
The stress response you mentioned.
Right. Stress triggers hormone release, CRH, ACTH, then cortisol. And cortisol directly affects both the gut, changing things like its lining permeability and microbial composition.
And the brain binding to receptors there.
Exactly. And we see that chronic stress, when that HPA axis is constantly activated or dysregulated, is linked to changes in the gut microbes, a leaky gut, inflammation.
And ultimately, problems with brain function, even contributing to CNS disorders.
Then there's the direct nervous system connection, the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic branches.
Including the vagus nerve.
Yes, transmitting signals both ways between the gut and the central nervous system. And don't forget the enteric nervous system.
The little brain and the gut lining.
Right. It communicates directly with the gut microbes. And the microbes influence its development and function. They even promote serotonin production there.
You mentioned the vagus nerve. That seems like a key highway.
It really is. It's the fastest, most direct neural route. Connects brainstem to gut, regulating homeostasis, inflammation, mood, stress response. It senses microbial molecules.
So microbes can activate it.
Directly or indirectly, yes. Signals travel up to the brainstem, then on to areas involved in stress and cognition. There are animal studies showing specific bacteria.
Like Bifidobacterium longum.
That's a great example, shown to reduce anxiety-like behavior in mice, and that effect depended on the vagus nerve being intact.
So hormonal signals, nerve signals, what else? Neurotransmitters.
Absolutely. Gut microbes can actually synthesize or metabolize neurotransmitters we know well, serotonin, GABA, dopamine, or adrenaline.
Wow. Do these cross into the brain?
Some precursors might, or they influence the brain indirectly via signaling within the gut, activating the ENS or vagus nerve. Altering gut microbes can change neurotransmitter levels and even receptor expression in the brain itself.
You mentioned serotonin. Most of that's made in the gut, right?
Yeah. About 95%, yes, by specialized cells called enterochromaffin cells. And the GM signals to these cells, germ-free mice, for instance, have lower gut serotonin.
And things like tryptophan metabolism are involved, too.
Critically, gut microbes influence how tryptophan, an amino acid, is broken down either toward serotonin or down the kynurenine pathway. Kynurenine metabolites can cross the blood-brain barrier and affect neural function.
What about GABA? That's important for calming the brain.
Yes, inhibitory. Some microbes produce GABA directly, and changes in gut bacteria are linked to GABA receptor levels in the brain. Plus, microbial products like short-chain fatty acids can potentially feed into the GABA cycle in the brain.
Okay, so HPA axis, nervous system, neurotransmitters, any other major communication lines?
The endocannabinoid system, or ECS, it interacts with the HPA axis cognition gut barrier, and it talks back and forth with the gut microbiota. Changes in microbes affect ECS signaling.
And the immune system, of course.
Huge connection. Immune cells in the gut constantly monitor microbes. Maintaining the gut barrier is key. If it breaks down, microbial bits like LPS can leak out, trigger system-wide inflammation.
And that chronic inflammation is linked to cognitive issues.
Definitely. And finally, don't forget the direct impact of microbial metabolites.
Things the microbes produce.
Exactly, like short-chain fatty acids, SCFAs from fiber fermentation, butyrate, propionate, acetate.
What do they do?
Locally, they fuel gut cells, strengthen the barrier, regulate inflammation. Systemically, they influence immunity, can cross the blood-brain barrier, affect neurotransmitters, and even have epigenetic effects.
And bile acids.
Also key. Modified by gut microbes, they act like hormones, influencing metabolism, inflammation, the gut barrier, and they can reach the brain and modulate the HPA axis. Altered bile acids are seen in conditions like Alzheimer's.
Okay, so bringing it all together, this complex communication network links microbes, the stress axis, and cognition. What's the evidence for that connection impacting how we actually think?
Well, stress is a major factor. We see that early life stress impacts both HPA development and the gut microbiota. This can lead to altered stress responses later on.
And potentially cognitive effects.
Potentially, yes. Some animal studies have even shown that transferring the gut microbes from stressed animals to non-stressed ones can transfer some of the stress-related behaviors and HPA changes.
That's pretty dramatic.
It is. And germ-free mice studies consistently show they have deficits in learning and memory compared to colonized mice, often linked to changes in brain factors like BDNF.
Brain-derived neurotrophic factor important for neurons.
Right. And sometimes colonizing these mice later can rescue some of those deficits, although timing matters. Even using antibiotics in normal animals can sometimes lead to temporary cognitive problems.
What about evidence in humans? It's harder to study, I imagine.
It is, but evidence is building. How we're colonized at birth seems linked to later neurocognitive development. Antibiotic use, especially heavy or early use, shows associations with poorer cognitive outcomes in some studies.
Though antibiotics are crucial sometimes.
Of course. And interestingly, in conditions like C. diff infections, where dysbiosis is severe, treating it sometimes with fecal microbiota transplantation, FMT, has been linked to improvements not just in gut health, but also mood and cognition in some cases.
And things like probiotics.
The results are mixed, but often promising. Some studies show benefits for stress perception, mood, and even cognitive performance, sometimes alongside changes in cortisol levels, but there's a lot of variation between studies.
Chronic stress conditions like IBS seem relevant here too.
Very relevant. In IBS or IBD, you often see gut dysbiosis alongside cognitive complaints or brain fog, and studies are finding correlations between specific microbial changes and alterations in brain activity or cognitive scores.
But it's not always about the HPA axis being the main driver, is it? Can the gut microbes affect cognition more directly?
That's an important point the research makes. Yes, the GM can influence cognition through pathways that might not heavily involve the HPA axis.
Like the vagus nerve.
Exactly. Or immune signaling, or those microbial metabolites like SCFAs directly reaching the brain. There's also evidence emerging from neurodegenerative disease research, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, suggesting the gut microbiota influences disease progression and cognitive symptoms, potentially through HPA-independent routes.
That study transplanting microbes from old rats to young ones.
And seeing cognitive decline transferred. Yes, that points towards a more direct microbial influence, potentially independent of chronic stress pathways. Diet also plays a huge role here, influencing both the GM and cognition, sometimes without major HPA changes.
So it seems understanding this whole MGB axis, including the HPA connection, is really crucial for thinking about cognitive health.
It really is, and it opens up potential avenues for diagnostics and maybe even therapeutics in the future.
What are the next steps for research?
Well, researchers want to pin down the precise mechanisms, especially in humans. We need more studies that can show causality, not just correlation. And exploring the GM's role in specific HBA disorders like Cushing's or Addison's disease is another important area.
But the main takeaway is clear.
Yes, the interaction between your gut microbes, your endocrine system like the HPA axis, and your neural systems is absolutely fundamental for optimal cognitive function.
Which really leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over.
Given this incredibly complex two-way link between the microbes in your gut, your body's stress response, and your variability to think, learn, and remember, how might your simple everyday choices, what you eat, how much you move, how you manage stress, how might those choices be constantly reshaping not just your physical health, but the actual landscape of your mind?